So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to the next in the series of faction showcases, and today we will be taking a look at fan favourite ROHAN, and of course we'll be starting off with their siege and infantry, which you might expect to be a little bit sparser than certain other areas of their army, and you are in a way correct, although they do have a few interesting units within their infantry corps which do give them some unique strengths, very similar to how Khan finds some good strengths in their survivable infantry. ROHAN have got a few hidden gems in there as well, but we'll start off with their siege, and again, Khan is probably the best faction to compare them to, because no faction is quite so cavalry heavy as Khan and ROHAN are to one another, and no faction can field quite so many horse archers, as we shall see in just a moment. But one key difference actually is worth remarking upon when it comes to the basic catapult and the basic ballista, which we can see here. Usually I skim right on over these, but one difference between them and Khan is that they can bring these at all. Khan, of course, only able to bring the black powder hwacha, which is a somewhat unpredictable piece of siege equipment. Not useless, but certainly not the sort of thing that you can bring in sort of a standard situation on a 1v1 in a field battle, for example, because it's just too wild, whereas the catapult and the ballista potentially you might want to, but of course they are a little bit more of a known variable when you compare them to the hwacha, so you know, just the option, having the option to have these more sort of standardized pieces of siege equipment is nice. Moving on to the infantry, and this is a unit which of course they share in common with quite a lot of the good kingdoms of men, and that is the civilians. Only cost 150, their attack values of 4 are actually not dreadful for a unit that only costs 150, as we've said before. But really you're only going to be bringing the civilians if you've got a little bit of money left and you want to maybe have a sneaky place to put your general in or something along those sorts of lines. Other than that, they're just going to be there for cannon fodder and a very cheap unit. And as it happens, ROHAN do have some cheap units that they can bring instead of that, starting off with the Eastmark Spearmen, which we can see over here. They used to be called something else. I think they just used to be called ROHAN Spearmen or Eorling Militia or something along those lines. They are now called the Eastmark Spears, and they do have an armour upgrade, and in fact you can actually see it does make a small difference, as it does with most militia tier units. But going back to the first one there, you can see that it does effectively have the like with most other armour upgrades, or all other armour upgrades I should say, bolstering it by 2. So this is technically an armour value of 5, which is better than a lot of militia units that you could care to mention. And the Eastmark Spears are also quite a bit cheaper than quite a lot of other militia units in the good kingdoms of men. When we looked at the Dol Amroth militia, for example, they were 400. Whereas these guys are only 350, so they are approaching the sort of cost you would imagine to see on some of the evil men factions, which does mean that if you want to invest a little bit into maybe other units throughout your army, which is very likely as ROHAN that you'll want to invest money outside of your infantry corps, then maybe having just some Eastmark Spearmen on the flank could be just the thing you need, because obviously they are militia spears. That does mean that they have a bonus fighting cavalry, and honestly with a not dreadful armour score and a decent shield value, they make a half decent tar pit as well. And an attack value of 4 is better than some other spears, and they have quite a lot of men in the unit, so overall a very good unit for their cost. And this is where ROHAN come into their own, I think. They have a lot of cheaper options which they can use to really pad out their infantry line and make it a real nuisance. And in that same vein, we have the Eastmark Axemen, which are essentially very cheap, well, sort of cheaper line infantry, and in a way, based on their cost, you could say that they are in the same sort of vein as the Dol Amroth Doran Ernil swordsmen that are their militia unit. However, the key difference is the Eastmark Axemen have got more men in the unit than a unit like that from their neighbours to the south in Dol Amroth and Gondor, and also the Eastmark Axemen, being Axemen, have got a slightly higher attack than swordsmen will have. But they do suffer a little bit for this in their defensive skill. Obviously you can't really expect them to take on anything outside of other low tier units and expect to win, but if you saturate your line with cheap infantry like this, it's going to take enemies quite a while to hack your way through, provided you set your line up well, because ROHAN do not have any pikes, so you can't rely on that. You have to sort of be a little bit more savvy with your numbers in order to hold up an enemy infantry force of higher quality. However, getting into some of the more deadly units, we shall start off with the Riddermark Axemen, which of course have been a mainstay ever since vanilla, and this is the first two-handed axe unit that we will see as ROHAN, and of course this means they're effective against armour. And you know, having a look at their stats, the total defense of 10 is actually not dreadful. I mean, they do have that shield, of course, which does buff that up a little bit more compared to their rivals. The Rudauer Axemen would be a pretty good sort of comparison tool to use here. But overall, the Riddermark Axemen are a little bit tougher. They do have that attack of 10, of course, charge bonus of 8, and also 183 men in the unit is also pretty good. So you can see here that ROHAN can field A lot of their lower tier infantry units have, I'd hesitate to call the Riddermark Axemen low tier units, but they're on the lower end of mid tier certainly. But they have quite a lot of men in the unit, so Rohan, despite being a primarily cavalry focused faction, they can field a lot of infantry should they so choose, and against armoured factions in particular, the Riddermark Axemen are obviously going to be a very useful tool. Again, you're going to want to get them in and amongst stuff like spearmen to make sure that they aren't charged by cavalry, but as soon as they get into a sustained fight with other armoured units, particularly if they get their charge off, of course, they will be a very dependable unit for you. Quite a common unit to see is Rohan as well in terms of their infantry. Another spear unit that Rohan have, and this is I think to compensate a little bit for their complete lack of pikes, they do have a lot of spear options, so that means they can obviously form up a shield wall front line should the need arise. And this is the Riddermark spears, which are the middle ground between the Rohirrim spears, and obviously this means that their stats are a little bit higher, a little fewer men per unit, but again they are tougher. The shield value of 6, of course the armour is also slightly higher, but you cannot upgrade the armour, so that is worth saying. But their chainmail should see them in pretty good stead. Decent amount of men per unit though. I mean, when you get into some of the other factions, in particular stuff like the good kingdoms of men that are a little bit more on the side of quality rather than quantity, some of these spear units will end up having significantly less men in the unit. Not so with Rohan, and their spears are one of the tools that you can use to really hammer home your advantage in the cavalry theatre, of course, but they are also very important for helping to hold down your front line with how long they can last in melee. And of course in a siege you're going to be very dependent on your spears to plug up those gaps where pikes would traditionally be. Now, previously known as the Dismounted Royal Guard, we shall have a look at the Westmark Spearmen, which are the best of all of the footbound spears that Rohan can bring. And as we can see again, it's just a very similar story. They have excellent morale, they have that bonus fighting cavalry, can make shield wall. But the key thing here is obviously that they have slightly higher stats across the board. They're still not very expensive. I mean, honestly, they are still a mid-tier unit. Rohan don't have much in the way of high-tier infantry. I'd say they only really have 2 units that you could picture being higher tier. But having said that, these are a very dependable spearman unit. I mean, they have decent defensive values. Their armour is good, their shield is good, so arrows are not going to bother them too much. Obviously, as spears, they do have a malus against other infantry, and their attack is low. But if you want to invest a little bit more in your spears, then this might be a good way to go. Obviously, do bear in mind they have slightly less per unit as well. One of the additions that Reforged has made, and something which a lot of people were asking for quite some time, was the Westmark Infantry, and this is essentially the standard line infantry of Rohan. And again, this is basically just a mid-tier unit. Their stats are actually quite comparable to the Gondor Infantry in many ways, and Gondor Infantry is basically the base mark that I use to compare all sort of line infantry of this type against, to be honest with you, because it just makes the most sense in my mind. The difference being that the Westmark Infantry have got a little bit more in terms of attack, but they do have a little bit less in terms of defence, and of course you cannot upgrade their armour from its base, so maybe the Minas Tirithlan Swordsman would actually be a better point of comparison here. But if you think you're going to be coming up against a pretty substantial infantry force that you need to have a little bit more killing power against, a little bit more sturdiness in melee against other similar types of units, then the Westmark Infantry fill that role. A very nice tool for Rohan to have that they haven't always had. And then finally, this is a unit which I was debating putting in its own layer, I suppose, but this is a higher tier unit because they cost 900, the Westmark Marshals, formerly known as the Marshals of the Red. They frighten nearby enemy infantry, which is obviously a difference between them and the Riddermark Axemen, but of course the primary difference is found in their stats. They are significantly better in melee than the Riddermark Axemen. They have a much higher attack. Again, you might not think that 5 is a significant difference, but based on how the stats work now, it most certainly is. They also have decent defensive skill, decent armour, decent shield value, and in terms of this unit, this is one of the units that you can definitely embed in your lines, and it will do a lot of damage against armoured units indeed. Now, of course, against stuff like the elves, you probably want to give the Westmark Marshals a miss, because while their defensive skill is okay for a two-handed axe unit, it is still not going to do too well against elven swordsmen, or even human swordmasters as well. Stuff like the swordmasters of Karnan will relish the chance to go toe-to-toe with the Westmark Marshals. But having said that, they are probably the primary damage dealers 9 times out of 10 in the Rohan infantry line. You do need to keep an eye on them if you're facing Rohan, because otherwise you could find your front line and your basic line infantry slowly start to melt before the Westmark Marshals, as opponents of Rohan have seen in the past in this mod. Finally, Rohan do have an option for a general's bodyguard on foot, and that is the Hornburg Sentries. Again, this is one of the few shielded units in the game which can also boast an armour-piercing weapon with those warhammers, of course. They can inspire nearby troops and frighten nearby enemy infantry. as most of these sort of very high tier generals bodyguards can do. 1200 is honestly not a bad amount of money to spend. Normally you'll be looking at 1300 or even 1400 for the equivalent elven unit, the Gwaith-e Myrdain, if you want this kind of unit, and their stats are honestly very good. Their total defense is huge, mainly because they boast a high shield value, decent skill, and obviously high armor as well. This is really the one unit of Rohan's which is essentially outstanding in all areas, including its attack. But of course there aren't very many of them. It's standard fare for General's Bodyguard, and if you look at other similar units like the Gwaith-e Myrdain, they are going to suffer the same problems. You do need to support them. Very good in the siege, of course, but also if you bring them in a field battle, you're probably going to be setting out your stall a little bit more defensively, which Rohan can do thanks to their skirmishers and sort of using their cavalry as a backstop. But even so, probably going to be a little bit more common in sieges than a field battle, but still a very strong unit all around, as you can see from these stats. But now we shall move on to what many people are going to be seeing as the main attraction, and that will be the archers and of course the cavalry. So no prizes for guessing what Rohan's focus is here based on all the horses that you can see before you. But actually one of the factions I'm going to be comparing Rohan to here will actually be Linden, interestingly enough, but we'll get to that when we come to it. It's obviously not a direct comparison, more of something that they share in common. We'll start off with the archers, which is where they don't have something in common with Linden. Mainly the Rohirrim archers will struggle in a pure skirmish fight. The main reason you'll want to bring something like the Riddermark archers, who cost 550, only have a missile attack of 4 and have a low unit count, which essentially puts them in a bit of a sticky situation against pretty much anything. In fact, based on these stats and based on the cost, I would even sort of put my neck out and say they're probably the worst archers from a cost effectiveness proposition in the game. But they're not completely useless, mainly because if you want to be more defensive as Rohan, or if you want to give your cavalry a little bit of extra support, you're going to need to deploy some archers somewhere, and of course having that range presence certainly helps. And if you want to adopt a little bit more of a sort of putting these guys at the front as a meat shield and trying to sort of waste your opponent's arrows on them, that will be their primary function. As with most other trash archers, of course, they just will be a little bit less effective at giving it back in return, I would say. The better of the two archers here, though, is certainly the Helmingas. Now, they have a missile attack of 6, which is actually above average for a lot of human archers. They do cost 700, though, so actually a unit that you could probably compare them to would probably be something like the Khazad Orc Hunters, actually, from Khazad-dûm. Of course, they can use sharpened stakes. Their stats are decent all around. I mean, you can throw them into melee, but honestly, you know, their low defensive skill, honestly, and their attack is pretty decent. I mean, yeah, for Rohan infantry standards, in terms of damage, I suppose you would count them as a sort of hybrid infantry unit overall. But yeah, if you want to be a little bit more serious about your skirmish line, then you will want to bring the Helmingas, because they are, you know, much better. But you can only bring 2 before the cost increases, so if you want to go full archers, you will need to invest in the Riddermark archers as well. But overall, a decent unit here for Rohan, but a lot of Rohan's long-range pressure will come from their horse archers, as we will see a little later on. Now, this is a unit which is almost indispensable in the Rohan line, and that is the Eowyn's Shield Maidens. Partly because of their ability to inspire nearby troops, which will keep your inevitably in parts low-tier infantry line in the fight for just that much longer, but also their ability to deal out incredible amounts of damage very quickly. Of course, axe throwers can be venomous when they're in the right position in your line, and of course, you know, with a missile attack of 11 that is AP, that is no different with the Eowyn Shield Maidens. They fulfill a very important role in Rohan's army. Of course, you can use them for all sorts of things, whether that be punishing enemy cavalry that gets too close to your infantry's backlines, or using them to really hurt the enemy's infantry as it engages your much cheaper spear line, for example. They can be very, very good at that. And also, they're not half bad in melee themselves either. They're not world beaters, but they can hold their own, and that inspiration bonus is going to be the most important thing, honestly, to keep your numbers in check. But yeah, very, very important unit in Rohan, this. 9 out of 10 armies that you see as Rohan are going to bring them, unless they're going for some sort of all-cavalry cheese, which, you know, you're not going to earn yourself many friends by doing that. And then here, finally, we have another hybrid unit, and this is definitely counting as a hybrid unit, the Meduzeld Guard. You can see here from their stats, and hybrid units in terms of their ranged and their ranged cavalry units are something which Rohan boasts quite a lot of, and this is what puts them into a little bit of a comparison with Linden. Obviously, in general, Linden's troops are going to be a little bit stronger overall, but less numerous and more expensive. But the Meduzeld Guard here, very good stats on them. They sort of fulfill the role as hybrid infantry units as well, obviously with these stats, but missile attack of 11, armor piercing as well. They cost 1200, so technically speaking they do belong in sort of the general's bodyguard bracket. Having a look, obviously, I think these guys are actually, based on what they carry, they are javelins and not axe throwers. I know they pull out an axe in melee, but yeah, very, very powerful. One of the better javelin units in the game. I probably wouldn't say they're as good as the Demons of the Desert, because I know the Demons of the Desert send people flying with their projectiles. I'm not sure whether the Meduseld Guard can do that, but even so, very, very good hybrid unit. They've been made a little bit better throughout the patches since they've been implemented. But they are still a risk, particularly if you bring them in a field battle, because your opponent is going to try and focus them out somehow. And now, we come to Rohan's Cavalry, which is of course the main event, and we start off with the Eastmark Scouts, the first of many Lancers in Rohan's line. This is a unit which is again similar to Linden's unit of a similar type, the 4 Linden Scouts, because they are a horseman that can hide anywhere, so you can use them as ambush cavalry, which is definitely unique. But having said that, their stats are obviously going to be dreadful in melee. If they get caught by any sort of melee cavalry, they're probably going to break off very quickly because of the amount of casualties they're going to take. But if your opponent doesn't pay much attention to your army, and you can sneak a unit of Eastmark Scouts in behind their lines, you could potentially do quite a bit of damage with them. They only cost 400 as well, so they are the cheapest of your cav units by far. Moving on, well, I wouldn't say by far, because we will move on now to the Eastmark Riders, which are, again, just sort of more standard Lancers. They're a little bit tougher overall, and that's what you're really paying for. Whether or not you want that toughness or the ability to hide really depends on the situation, but 600, of course. Eastmark Riders, basic Lancers, charge bonus of 10, armor piercing charge. Other than that, very similar to other Lancers. And Rohan's melee cavalry, or at least their sort of non-range cavalry, is almost entirely Lancers, and it's in this way that they really differentiate themselves from Khand, which are primarily cav-to-cav fighters. So Rohan a little bit more risky, but I'll go into that a little bit more when we sort of get into the summary at the end. Moving on to the Riddermark Cavalry, again you can see that again the stats just go up, and charge bonus of 15 is pretty significant. 750 is not a lot of money to pay for a cavalry unit with a charge bonus of 15, particularly when you've got 90 men in the unit, which is, again, a faction like the Elves would love 90 men in some of their cavalry units, but Rohan, of course, very numerous on horseback. Armor piercing charge, slightly better stats across the board. And then moving on, the last of the sort of non-multiple HP Lancers that they get are the Aerid of Aldburg, which again is just another step up. They can form Wedge, which is very situational, but it's still nice to have nonetheless. Again, the stats are better. 850 is kind of a lot. So you do need to be careful not to overspend on your Lancers, because if you overcommit on Lancers, then they become kind of easy to counter, and people are obviously going to expect cavalry from Rohan, so you do need to be careful with your composition, what you bring. But the Aerid of Aldburg are the finest of the massable Lancers that you can bring. And then we get on to the 2 Generals Bodyguard cavalry units that you can bring. First of all, we have the 1st Marshal's Bodyguard, which again are multiple HP Lancers, so they sort of common units in common that they have are going to be stuff like the Dragon's Wrath Warlords from Rune and the Gandalf's Retinue Bodyguard from Gondor. The differences being that Rohan tend to focus a little bit more around attack and doing damage and speed than their more heavily armoured brethren. And, speed is not really something that I can show you in this sort of way of doing a faction showcase, but Rohan's cavalry, as a general rule, is pretty swift. Swifter than their neighbours, let's put it that way. And, good stats across the board here. But more often than not, I feel like you're going to be seeing this unit on an open field, the Sons of Yule, because they are, of course, Rohan's knights. Something worth mentioning immediately is the fact that they are 100 florins cheaper than most knights. I believe they share this in common with Rudau's Hranadai nobles. That again, Rohan's sort of more attack-minded nature with their cavalry comes to the fore here, because they have slightly lower armour values than most other knights, bar the Noldorin Horse Lords and the Hranadai nobles from the people in the far west. But having said that, again, knights are the kings of the open battlefield, because they are so difficult to stop once they get rolling. Very, very powerful, and a little bit cheaper than their neighbours as well, which is always nice. Full charge bonus of 20, Inspire, Frighten, all the good stuff. Now, however, we move on to the ranged cavalry contingent, which actually they have less options here than Khand have, but you could also argue that they pack in some hybrid units which more than make up for that. The Eastmark Horse Archers are just basic Horse Archers, however, so this is something which they do share in common with Khand. 675 is a decent amount of money to spend, but of course Horse Archers are invaluable when it comes to harassing enemy lines. They are maybe a little bit predictable when they come from Rohan and Khand, but trying to prepare for Horse Archers harassing your lines is easier said than done in the hands of a good player. and obviously Eastmark Horse Archers are the entry level of this. But a unit which has really impressed me in recent patches from the Reforged team has got to be the Riders of the Fold. Mainly because they used to be, back in vanilla, useless to bring, to be honest with you. Most Horse Archers weren't great, honestly, but the Riders of the Fold were horrendously overpriced for what they offered you. Now, however, at 750, they are one of the most, to my mind, cost-effective Horse Archers that there are. Mainly because, you know, when it comes to Horse Archers being cost-effective, a lot of it comes down to player skill, honestly, because they are quite micro-intensive. If you leave them out in the open under enemy archer fire for too long, they will fall away, no matter what they are, really. But their armour of 6 and their shield of 3 will protect them somewhat, more so than a lot of other cavalry. But even so, great harassment tool to my mind, 750 also. The price reduction since vanilla has really helped them. And then we come to the 2 hybrid units, starting off with the Riddermark Skirmishers, a very important unit in Rohan. Obviously they were given a 2-handed axe in the most recent, well, in 0.96 I think. But of course they are Javelin Cavalry, so this is really where Rohan are going to be waging their cav to cav war, because as you saw, all except the Sons of Yule were pure Lancers, which means they're going to perform quite poorly against pure melee cavalry focused factions, stuff like Dol Amroth, all of the Orcs, or of course Khand. So in order to get the better of those kinds of factions, you're going to need to use the Riddermark Skirmishers, because again their AP Javelins are going to be very, very useful at plugging them away at a distance, and they double as melee cavalry in melee. So they have that bonus against cavalry and a huge melee attack of 10. And, well, I think the effectiveness against armour only extends to their javelins, question mark. They do use a 2-handed axe, but I'm not sure how the rules carry over to this, because I know that the putting armour piercing on a melee cav unit like this was something taken away from the Wargs because it was considered overpowered, so I'm honestly not sure what to do. I'm sure that one of the devs will correct me down in the comments if I'm wrong. But obviously they are fantastic in melee against other cavalry units. Almost indispensable in the Rohan cavalry lineup, because they really paper over the cracks that having an all-lancer lineup bar one unit in the pure melee cavalry stakes holds them. Now, to be fair, a pure melee cav unit is something they do kind of have, but it is a hybrid with a horse archer, and that is the Red Shield of Erkenbrand. Now, this is a unit which has come in for some criticism over the time that they have been implemented, because most people think that they aren't really worth their 1,000 florin price tag. To be fair, ever since 0.96.1, I don't know whether this is still the case, because I haven't seen anyone bring them, which is, well, I saw someone bring them in the most recent time we saw Rohan, and they were the last unit left standing, so that maybe bodes well, but other than that I haven't really seen most people bring them. Most of that does come down to their price tag, but overall they are very tough. They have an armour of 8, shield of 6, and that defensive skill of 12. They are honestly very accomplished melee cavalry unit. But having said that, they are quite expensive. If you wanted to go for a full horse archer build, you probably need to bring them, honestly, because they form a very sturdy centre to that indeed. They look fantastic, of course, but do bear in mind that if you do dump 1,000 florins into a unit, you do need to look after them. It's a very similar story with this unit as it would be for something like the Wardens of Harlenden from Linden. They are a little bit slower, however, than their other horse archers, I believe, as a result of them being a little bit more bulky. But yeah, that is Rohan's extensive cavalry roster, skimmed over somewhat. And now we'll go back to the army selection screen and I'll talk a little bit more about what I think. Rohan are an interesting one, I'll give them that. If we have a skim over of some of their morale, you can obviously see it's on the lower side for some of their lower tier units, but again, Rohan do have the units necessary to sort of inspire them to stay in the battle for as long as they possibly can and maximise their potential. As far as ammunition goes, again, the Helmingas have got an ammo of 18, which is very good for a unit of their type, and an ammo of 20 of the Riddermark Archers is pretty decent, makes up a little bit for the fact their stats are so low and they cost a little bit more than other units of similar type. But Rohan do tend to attract players that main them quite passionately. I mean, if any of you are on the Discord, I'm sure quite a lot of people that watch this are, you'll notice that obviously you've got players like DI or Celtic which really sort of hone in on Rohan and really play Rohan quite a lot, whereas other players tend to avoid Rohan for the reason that to get the most out of Rohan you do need to learn them quite a lot, because they are, when you compare them with Khand, they are higher risk but potentially higher reward, because with all of these Lancers, which, you know, this is where the real meat and bones of Rohan's army often comes from, you know, a lot of damage dealing potential with a lot of these Lancers here. You back them up with some of the hybrid units like the Riddermark Skirmishers and some of the Horse Archers for harassment purposes as well. It can be, in the hands of the right player, it can be a nightmare to fight against Rohan. Their infantry is honestly not as, it doesn't get as much credit from people as I think it deserves. I mean, yes, there are gaps in it. They don't have any pole arms, which is a big miss, especially considering that in defensive sieges, for example, if you want to really plug up a choke point, forming phalanx can often be a very, very good move. But Rohan do get around this somewhat by having so many spears that they can choose from. The introduction of the Westmark infantry into Reforged a little while ago has also helped bulk out their infantry line a little bit. The Westmark marshals are a very good unit. They've performed consistently in most battles I've seen them used for Rohan. Most recent one aside, where they were up against Linden, which is a faction they can't really get their teeth into quite so much. And also the Airwind Shield Maidens, again one of the most important units to Rohan because of their ability to deal damage and to inspire. They've got a lot of good units, but I will say that unlike Linden, which we did last time, actually no, we did Umbar last time, I'm losing track, but unlike Linden and Umbar to an extent, they are more difficult to play because you need to have good micro with all of this cavalry running around. If you can get the most out of Rohan, however, you will have a lot of fun playing as them. Same can't be said as your opponents though, because again it can be a nightmare to fight against Rohan in the hands of a player that really knows them inside and out. For me, I prefer playing a little bit more as Khan because I'm a little bit more sloppy with my Cav micro, honestly. And that can cost me very dearly when I'm playing as Rohan most of the time, because with all of these lances, if they get caught, it can be a bad time. But if you want to play as Rohan, it's not as daunting a task to learn how to play them as you might think, but if you just put in a little bit of time, you can have a lot of joy with them. So yeah, I hope you found this somewhat informative, and the next faction we'll be doing, we're coming to the end now of the faction overviews. There are only 2 more after this one, and we will be cycling back to the Elves, and we will be doing Lothlorien next, and then we will be ending on Arthedain. So yeah, I will be moving, I think, back into the top 10s after I finish the showcases. So yeah, I hope you found this somewhat informative. There'll probably be a battle replay out between now and the Lothlorien showcase as well. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you join me for whatever is next.